Is Genesis just a glorified Hyundai, or is it a true luxury car? I own both a Genesis and Hyundai and can tell you firsthand that Genesis is far superior in every aspect. Now, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, well, duh, of course Genesis is better. It's a luxury car brand, and yeah, you would be totally right. But this video is for the doubters, the haters, and for those skeptical of the Genesis brand who might not think it's a true luxury car and think it's just an overpriced, cheap Hyundai. And I gotta admit, personally, I fell into that latter category of thinking it was an overpriced cheap Hyundai. That was before I went and test drove one and absolutely fell in love. So if you're someone like me who is very skeptical of the Genesis brand, I urge you, if there's one thing you take away from this video, go to your nearest local Genesis dealership and test drive one of their vehicles. I promise you, you will never look at the brand the same ever again. So to get this video started, I wanted to give a quick background and history lesson on the Genesis brand, where they came from, and why the public has always had such a hard time viewing them as a legit luxury car brand. So if we go all the way back to 2015, that is when the Genesis Motors division was officially established under the Hyundai Motor Group, and the first Genesis car was not officially released until 2016 for a model year 2017 vehicle. Now, prior to the Genesis brand, Hyundai had a luxury vehicle known as the EQ900 under the sub-brand name of Equus or Equus, how do you say that? This car was produced from 1999 up until 2016 and essentially was the first iteration of a luxury Genesis vehicle. Now, after the Genesis brand was officially born in 2015, they rebranded the existing EQ900 as the Genesis G90, which then went into production for model year 2017. That same year, the Genesis G80 was also released, and then it was not until 2019 that the Genesis G70 released. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, weren't the Hyundai Genesis cars the first official Genesis cars? And the answer to that question is yes and no. The Hyundai Genesis lineup launched under Hyundai in 2008 with the Hyundai Genesis sedan and then later the Hyundai Genesis Coupe in 2009. The Hyundai Genesis cars were different from the EQ900 Equus car in that the Hyundai Genesis cars were meant to be a luxury sports car, whereas the EQ900 was meant to be a true full-size luxury sedan meant to compete with something such as a Mercedes. A lot of people think that Hyundai Genesis is its own full-fledged brand or was its own full-fledged brand, but it's not. It was a lineup of cars produced under Hyundai, and the concept behind the Hyundai Genesis cars was to produce a luxury car, again, with sporty elements. Those luxury car concepts ended up selling really well for Hyundai, so much so that they decided to start up a completely new brand to be their luxury car brand, hence the modern day Genesis. Now, what is ironic about all this is that Genesis, despite officially announcing that they were separating from Hyundai back in 2015, did not actually do so until 2022. Now, just some quick clarification on that statement. Genesis did in fact become its own vehicle division under the Hyundai Motor Group back in 2015, but they actually didn't separate from the Hyundai dealerships and brand, if you will, up until about 2021, 2022, when they started making their own standalone Genesis dealerships. Leading up until 2022, if you wanted to buy a Genesis, you had to go to a Hyundai dealership, work with a Hyundai salesman, and later have your car serviced at a Hyundai shop if you ended up purchasing one. Now, to me, none of that sounds like a luxury car buying experience, and it makes perfect sense as to why no one has taken the Genesis brand seriously up until just recently. It's all about public perception. And so how do you convince the public that you are selling a luxury item if you have to go to a Hyundai dealership to buy it? The two words Hyundai and luxury don't quite go together. And the type of clientele that are going to want to purchase a luxury car, they're not going to want to set foot anywhere near a Hyundai dealership. So in that aspect, when most people see a Genesis car, they immediately think it's just a fancy overpriced Hyundai, because for the entirety that the brand has been around, up until just the past few years, the Genesis brand has been 100% tied to Hyundai, and most people still think that they are called a Hyundai Genesis. They don't realize that Genesis is its own full-fledged standalone company like Lexus. Genesis may have separated from Hyundai in a business and legal sense back in 2015, 2017, but the public perception, which is more important, is that they were still part of Hyundai and a Hyundai car, because you still had to purchase them from a Hyundai dealership. Now, if you fast forward to the time at which I'm making this video, in 2024, Genesis officially has separated from the Hyundai dealerships and now has its own standalone Genesis dealerships, in the same way that you have Toyota and Lexus or Honda and Acura. Quick note on that, Hyundai dealers will not do work on your Genesis beyond a simple oil change or tire rotation. So if you need warranty work done or repairs, they're going to send you to a Genesis dealership, which at times can be tricky because they're still being built and they're not as widespread. I, for instance, have to drive an hour to my nearest Genesis dealership because there's not one in my local area. But hopefully within the next few years, they'll get their dealer network up and going and it won't be a problem trying to find a Genesis dealership near you. So yeah, that's just a quick background on the Genesis brand, where they came from and kind of the idea behind it. Now, what's interesting about all this is that despite the Genesis brand having been around for nearly 10 years now, they didn't really start to capture the public's attention, car reviewers' attention and all that up until, about year 8 of the company being around, 2022, 2023 era. That's when the Genesis cars really took a step up and really became something that people were like, wow, this is a strong competitor to the already established luxury car market, BMW, Audi, Mercedes, Lexus, and so forth. So what is it about these new Genesis vehicles that really sets them apart from the Hyundai brand? Kind of getting back to the whole stereotype that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So one of the first main differences between the two brands is the ability to option a larger, more performance-oriented engine on the Genesis cars, something you cannot get on a Hyundai. Depending on the model, Genesis has a 3.3 liter V6, 3.5 liter V6, and now they have a 3.5 liter V6 electrical supercharged variant. Personally, I have the 3.3 liter in my G70 and it's a freaking blast to drive and it pulls crazy hard. You will never be able to get that kind of performance in a Hyundai car, aside from their electric vehicles, obviously. So the second major difference you'll notice between the Genesis and Hyundai vehicles is the overall design, both inside and outside the vehicles. In the Genesis cars, you get a much more exquisite, premium, and just luxury looking vehicle than you will on any Hyundai. And the level of design quality and just engineering and time and effort that they have put into the Genesis vehicles goes far beyond anything you get in the Hyundai cars, and honestly isn't even the same universe. Just take a look at some of these images going across your screen of the Genesis cars compared to Hyundai, and yeah, I think the images and pictures speak for themselves. So a third major difference between the Hyundai and Genesis cars is the fact that you can get those larger, more performance-oriented engines. You can get really nice luxury features like massaging seats and things such as adaptive suspension and adaptive dampers, which just really help to elevate the ride and drive experience. All of which are things that you cannot get on the Hyundai cars. But again, it is worth mentioning that in order to get all the things I just mentioned, the performance engine, adaptive suspension, adaptive dampers, massaging seats, all of that is only available on the highest, most expensive Genesis trims offered on their vehicles, which is going to cost you a significant pretty penny. And depending on the model you're buying versus the G70, GV70, or G80 can range anywhere from 60 up to 80, 90, and even on the G90 up to $100,000. So yes, while you are paying significantly more for a Genesis car depending on the trim and level you get, you are overall getting a much nicer car, a much more reliable car, a much higher quality car, and as I'll speak to later in the video, there's just something about when you drive a Genesis car and then go back to driving a Hyundai vehicle, the just overall refinement and drive experience and just like atmosphere of the vehicle is just on a totally different level than it is in a Hyundai. Now, the fourth major difference I've noticed between Hyundai and Genesis is that the electronics and technology work way better in the Genesis vehicles compared to Hyundai. However, this isn't necessarily true of the newer 2024, 2025 year model cars moving forward. That's because Hyundai has completely revamped the electronics and infotainment systems. But if you look at the 2023 year model and earlier Hyundai and Genesis cars, you will notice that the electronics and infotainment system and everything work way better and way faster in the Genesis vehicles. Like I said, I own a 2023 Genesis as well as a 2023 Hyundai, and the electronics and technology and infotainment system between those two cars could not be more different. While both brands share the exact same driver tech and infotainment systems, I have noticed that all the electronics work significantly better in my Genesis. For one, the boot up time for the infotainment system is almost nearly immediate in my Genesis, whereas in the Hyundai, it can take what seems to be an eternity for the infotainment system to boot up, for your maps to appear, for you to be able to access climate control, radio, etc. I've timed it in the Hyundai, and it ranges anywhere from around 15 to 30 seconds, just depending on the day. Now, just for everyone's entertainment, here is the raw clip of me starting up the Santa Fe. It took around 47 seconds. So I just pressed the on button, and we are waiting for the infotainment system to just even turn on. Okay, there's the driver profile. Hit log in, and I just clicked the climate control button right then. Not terribly slow, pretty quick, but it's still loading up all the stuff. There it goes, finally loads up. Okay, now I go and I click the map button, and I press that thing hard. Like, I really pressed that map button in to make sure it registered it. Still not doing anything, not even attempting to pull up the maps. I go and I click the button again. Finally pulls up after 47 seconds. Then compared, if we look at my Genesis, pressing the start button, immediately the driver profile screen pulls up. I didn't tap it hard enough, but confirm. And then I hit the climate button, same as in the Santa Fe. Climate controls immediately all pop up. I hit the map button. Immediately the map pops up. Literally as quick as that. And it is important to note that both of these cars are brand new, and both of them are a 2023 year model. Now, I have also noticed that the blind spot blinker system is a bit slower in the Hyundai compared to the Genesis. It takes about half a second to a second longer than my Genesis between when you press the blinker stalk down to when it appears in your gauge cluster. Now, it is enough of a lag that when I'm driving the Hyundai, I have to remember to turn my blinker on sooner than I normally would in the Genesis, just so that I can see my blind spot when I need to. Now in my Genesis, the blinker camera pops up almost immediately as soon as you put your blinker on. Now, another feature that both cars have, but is much better in my Genesis, I have noticed, is the highway driving assist, known as HDA, which is essentially autopilot. The car will steer for you without having to touch the steering wheel, and it's pretty great. Now, in the Genesis, HDA works flawlessly as long as you're not going over 75 miles an hour, and as long as you're not on super windy roads. The HDA in the Hyundai, however, is not nearly as good. It struggles to stay between the lines on the interstate, even if there's a slight curve on the road, and it for sure cannot handle city roads or windy roads, even going at slower speeds than the Genesis. As you will see in this video, I let my Genesis take this turn at 50 miles an hour, and it had absolutely no issues, whereas if we play the clip from the Hyundai, even going at a slower speed, it still could not take that same turn without me having to intervene. Now, I just want to add this for context. Both cars are the same model year, and both cars have version 1.0 of HDA, but for some reason, HDA is much more refined in my Genesis. Now, this is not to say that the HDA in the 2023 Santa Fe is bad. It's just nowhere near as good as it is in the Genesis cars. Now, I also do want to point out that while I was making this video, HDA 2.0 did release on the new 2024 and 2025 Hyundai models, so it is going to be much more refined than version 1 and probably work just as good as version 1 works in the Genesis cars. But with all that being said, I would be curious to know if HDA 2.0 is better in the Genesis cars compared to the HDA 2.0 in the Hyundai vehicles. In the same way that HDA 1.0 was better in the Genesis vehicles compared to the HDA 1.0 in the Hyundai cars. But the last thing I have noticed between my Genesis and Hyundai is that while they both share the exact same tech and features, and both have the same quality of interior, Nappa leather heads-up displays, premium sound systems, the works, I have noticed that something about my Genesis just overall feels more refined, more elevated, and just a level above the Santa Fe or Hyundai equivalent. Now, I realize comparing a sedan to an SUV isn't the best comparison, but as I stated earlier, both cars literally have all the exact same equipment and same exact interior elements and materials, the only difference being that my Genesis has adaptive suspension, LSD, and adaptive dampers. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Hyundai brand, the calligraphy trim offered on the Santa Fe and Palisade models is the most expensive trim you can get and is meant to compete with other luxury SUVs in its segment. Although Hyundai isn't a luxury car, it's still meant to compete with luxury cars once you put the calligraphy trim on it. The calligraphy trim offers luxury car items such as Nappa leather, premium sound systems, and other tech and features normally only available on mid to higher spec luxury cars. So to conclude this video, no, Genesis is not just a Hyundai. It is its own full-fledged luxury car brand that has been giving the established German cars a serious run for their money. The Genesis motto is Luxury Evolved, which is a very neat motto because if you think about it, the Genesis brand is just that. Luxury evolved from all the other luxury car brands on the market. Well, most of them. Albert Biermann, who is the head engineer of the BMW M division for over 20 years, came to work for Hyundai and Genesis to share some of that magic and knowledge with them. Genesis also hired former Bentley designers to design their cars as well, hence why the Genesis cars look like low-key Bentleys at half the price. Now that's not my words, Car and Driver even stated this themselves. As always guys, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting and educational. If you did, be sure and slap that like button and leave a comment below saying how much you liked the video or how much you hated it. Either one works. With that being said, thanks for sticking around to the very end, and don't forget, stay glossy, my friends.